In this lesson, we're going to look at data collection. We're going to look at what a variable is and the different types of variable. We're going to look at different methods for conducting surveys. We're going to look at why we should take samples and the different ways of taking a sample. So here's an example of some data collected about students. We can see that they were asked their age, their gender, how good they were at maths, etc. Now all of these questions, all of the things asked are called the variables. So in this example there are 8 variables. Now the people asked, the students, are called the cases. So in this case there were 6 cases. And the observations recorded, these are the data. So a variable is a measurable quantity or describable attribute that can vary between the cases. The cases are the objects that are measured. So often it's people, but it doesn't have to be people. It could be trees, cars, buildings, etc. And the data are the actual recorded values or observations. Now, there are 4 types of variable: nominal, ordinal, discrete scale, and continuous scale. Let's have a look at each of these in turn. Now, a nominal variable is when its values are named categories. So, for example, gender. That's either male or female. They're named categories, so it's nominal. Country. Could be UK, France, German, Chinese, etc. Again, these are named categories, so they're nominal. Now, if you have a variable where its values can be ranked in order, then these are called ordinal variables. So for example, maths ability, if it's poor, average, good, these are categories, but they do go in a particular order, so this is an example of an ordinal variable. Let's imagine the students were asked to comment on the statement, Trump is good. Do they strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree or strongly agree? These responses can be ranked in order, so this is another example of an ordinal variable. And this specific example is called a Likert scale or Likert scale, and is quite common in questionnaires. Now the third type of variable is one which is called a discrete scale variable. Now this is if the values are counts or are measured on a scale which goes up in equal steps. So for example, number of siblings, that means number of brothers and sisters. That could be 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. But you can't have 1.5 brothers and sisters or 3.86. So this is numerical, but it goes up in steps. Another example, number of times been to the USA. Again, this could be 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. But you can't have 2.5. It goes up in steps. These are examples of discrete scale variables. Now, if you have a value which doesn't go up in steps, it can be a value, any number in a given range, this is called a continuous scale variable. So if the question was, how many hours do you study per week? It could be 0, could be 1, could be 10. Let's imagine the maximum is 50. But of course it could also be something like 2.5, 2.35, 2.356472, theoretically. So it could be any number in a given range. Another example is age. The age of the student could be 18, or if they wanted to be more accurate, 18.1, 18.1356. Again, theoretically, this could be any number in a given range. It doesn't have to go up in steps. So these are examples of a continuous scale variable. Now, if you collect the data yourself, this is called primary data. For example, you might do a survey of your classmates. If, however, you're using data that's being collected by someone else, this is called secondary data. So, for example, you might look at some data published regarding the National Student Survey. Now, if you want to collect some primary data, there are several ways of doing it. Nowadays, the most common way is to do it online. You can just set up an online survey, and it's generally quick and cheap to administer. However, one of the disadvantages with doing this is people often ignore requests to fill in online surveys. And also, when they do fill them in, often they can be tempted to give silly or unusable answers. So sometimes it's better to actually do it face-to-face, because some people prefer human interaction, and once you're conducting the questionnaire, the people are more likely to stay to the end, which they may not do if they were doing it online. However, a disadvantage of face-to-face is it can be expensive. You have to spend the time conducting the interviews yourself or employing staff to conduct the interviews for you. And plus, it's difficult to get a wide range of respondents if you're doing it face-to-face compared with online. We're going to talk a bit more about this later. So another way, rather than doing face-to-face, is maybe to use telephone. This is quicker and cheaper than face-to-face, but the disadvantage of that is a lot of people don't answer their phone, and if they do answer their phone, again, they may not be keen to talk to a stranger. Now let's look at a couple of definitions. A population is a complete set of objects from which we would like to collect data about. So your population could be all students at Warwick University, or it could be all oak trees in Coventry, or all male adults in the UK. However, it's usually too expensive or time-consuming to collect data from the whole population. So instead, we take a sample. So what is a sample? Well, a sample is a selection from the population. But to be useful, the sample must be representative of the whole population. If it doesn't represent the population, we say it is biased. So say our population is Warwick University students, and our sample just contains IFP students. Now the sample probably would be biased, as IFP has a far higher proportion of international students than Warwick University as a whole does. A better sample would contain students from many departments, so it would more likely represent the cross-section of student characteristics. Now there are many methods of sampling. We're going to look at 5. These are simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, cluster sampling, convenience sampling, and quota sampling. First, let's look at simple random sampling. Now this is a very good method for helping the sample to be representative of the population. Now what do we mean by random sampling? It means every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So what's the best way to conduct a simple random sample? Well, what we should do is obtain a list of all the population members. However, the drawback to this isn't always easy. But let's assume we have done this, then we should randomly select some of those members. So how would we select members from those lists, from that list? Well, the most effective way to do this is to use random numbers. So let's say, for example, there were 5,000 people in your population. What you would do is, using your list, assign the numbers 1 to 500 to the people on that list. And then let's imagine we wanted to sample 60 of them. we would use a calculator or a computer to randomly generate 60 numbers between 1 and 5,000. And we could then go down the list, selecting those 60 people which correspond to those generated random numbers. Now, the second method of sampling we're going to look at is called stratified random sampling. Now, this is really an extension of simple random sampling. And what we do here is we split the population into groups or strata, and then we random sample from each group using the method for simple random sampling that we did on the previous slide. Now, why would we do this? Well, we tend to do this if we think that the different groups may give different answers. Let's say, for example, you think that males and females might give different answers, then you may want to split the population into males and females. Now, when you take the sample from each group, the size of the sample should be relative to the number in each group. So, for example, let's imagine you want to select a sample of 12 people from a population comprising 200 women and 100 men. Now, there are twice as many women as men in the population, so there should be twice as many women as men in the sample. So there are 12 people in the sample, there should be twice as many women as men in the sample, so we should select 8 women and 4 men. Now, a third method of sampling is called cluster sampling. Now, this is often used if the data are being collected in person, such as face-to-face surveys or interviews. So say our population was all the people in Coventry. Now, if we decided to do a simple random sample, we may end up with people randomly scattered throughout Coventry. And if we try to visit them all, this might end up being very expensive or time consuming. So what we could do instead is we could use a simple random sample to pick several streets in Warwickshire. So let's say, for example, we wanted to pick 100 people altogether. Rather than randomly picking 100 people separately, we could pick 10 streets and then interview 10 people on each of those streets. It would reduce the travel. This is called cluster sampling because we've reduced it to 10 clusters. So this does reduce costs, but there is a risk of bias. We might not necessarily get a true reflection of everybody in Coventry because people on the same street may have similar characteristics. They may be related, or they may be friends, they may have similar interests, so we may not get the true spread of everyone throughout the population. The fourth method of sampling we're going to look at is called convenience sampling. Now, this is the simplest method of sampling, and it simply involves picking people who are nearby or easy to reach. So, for example, you may stand on a street corner and ask passers-by, or you just may email contacts in your address book. This is often used by market research companies. You've probably seen people standing on the streets with clipboards because it's cheap. You don't have to go to lots of different locations, you can just stand in one place. However, bias is very likely because imagine you're stood on just one street corner, you're only going to get people on that street. So you may only happen to get people who live near that street, or people who like shopping, or people who happen to be there at that particular time. And also, you only may be likely to get people who you want to talk to, so maybe just be people who look friendly. So there is a huge disadvantage of this, as it's very likely to be unrepresentative of the whole population. Now, the fifth example of sampling is called quota sampling. Now, this is just really an extension of convenience sampling, but it might be that you've already decided to ask particular numbers from particular groups, like in stratified sampling. So, for example, let's imagine you wanted to ask 20 females and 10 males. Now you wouldn't select them randomly, you would just simply ask the first 20 females and the first 10 males that passed you by. Now again, this does save cost and time, but again, there is a big risk of bias because it's not or unlikely to be representative of the whole population. So, to recap, today we've looked at the different types of variables. We've looked at different survey methods such as online, telephone, face-to-face. We've talked about the reasons for sampling, mainly because it's too expensive or time-consuming to ask the whole population. And we've looked at different sampling methods.